Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Panel members, thank you for giving up your time. I think this is an important topic for the Joint Special Operations University and community writ large, which includes not only the special operations community, but the intelligence community as well. You know, how will both adapt for the period of time that we've come out of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and how do we go through this transformation into the great powers competition, where it is unlikely that either communities are going to be operating in a totally ungoverned space, and there's going to be other allied nations, there's going to be diplomatic presence, there's going to be economic issues at play, going to be a lot of the national influence, elements of national power that are going to be there in the output, it's battle space. And so I think this is an incredibly important topic, and I want to say thanks for all of you, because you guys all of you bring a very unique background and a very important background to this discussion. So I think that we'll just kick it off here. And again, it's quite informal, as much as Zoom can be informal. It's not as easy as around the table, but I think the seminal question, and really all the other questions really devolve from this, is the IC, the intelligence community, and is the special operations community, are they individually and are they collectively prepared for the period of time for great powers competition? I think I don't want to manage this in a very ruthless fashion, but I believe that General Walters, if we could, Bob, if we could begin with you, followed by Chris Costa, and then perhaps Keith Lawless, and then we'll go from there. So, Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Doug, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with this team and have an opportunity to share some of my thoughts on these questions. And I'm, as a caveat, I'm speaking, as Clarissa mentioned, not for SOF intelligence, but from my experience with SOF intelligence over the years. And I think yes. I think yes is the answer to that. And the reason I say that is the strategic documents that have come out this year in March with the defense strategy, and then last month with the national security strategy. It clearly focuses SOF intel as well as all the services intel on China and Russia in that order. And so focusing on that, with that assistance, with that guidance, I think SOF intel is going to be moving in the right direction. And I know there's some other questions that we have ahead of us as far as how that's going to impact the relationship between SOF intel and the intelligence community. And I think there will be some adjustments that'll have to be made on that, but I'll wait on the specifics until we get to those questions. But in short, I think SOF intel is ready. It will be a change, but when we have the guidance from the top focusing us on this competition, I think we can follow orders and move out in that direction. And I'll go over to you, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Bob. It's great to see everyone. It is a privilege to be on this panel. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to dive right in and say, I do not think we are ready, but we're heading down that road. There's more work to be done. I'd like to reflect back to when I was leaving the White House in 2018 in January. I did a outbrief with CTC Sentinel at West Point to ask me perspectives on counterterrorism. And of course, the big question, and we saw it while I was at the White House, is how are we going to be postured for great power competition? And is that going to take away from the counterterrorism fight? And I said then, and I maintain to this day, that we can do both. We're a great nation. SOF certainly, and the IC has a significant role for both GPC as well as counterterrorism. So we can absolutely do both. That said, I think a great example of that is operating in gray zones like Syria today. So that, it occurred to me as I was leaving the White House, was a gray zone conflict. It just so happened that I focused particularly in my team on the policy aspects of counterterrorism at the White House. That said, it really was countering not just Russia, but Iran and other malign actors in the region. And today, if you look at what's happening in Syria, we're able to conduct counterterrorism raids. SOF is, at the same time, we are able to counter some malign Russian behavior. And I think that's kind of a symbolic of what's going to happen across the globe. We're going to have to counter those kinds of influences in other places. And it may very well not be kinetic. The second point I would make is I think I would go back to David Shedd, some remarks he made in 2020, and he suggested that we are ill-postured, the intelligence community is ill-postured to deal with things like emerging technologies quick enough, machine learning, AI. So I think it's just a matter of keeping up and exceeding some of these actors in a very competitive environment. I think we are on our way. I'd like to close on a positive note. I will say that I am heartened that our counterintelligence seems to be really ratcheting up their operations globally. We're countering disinformation by getting true information out and really calling out when there is disinformation. And more specifically, counterintelligence operations are identifying Chinese that are operating in places like New York, et cetera. So I think we have adapted. There's a long way to go.
Chris, thank you. Appreciate that. So, Keith, if you can kind of move on that theme a bit, obviously, after Keith is done, then I'd like to transition into the point that Bob made, which is, what changes are going to have to be made in terms of the cooperation and collaboration between the IC and SOF Intel. And I can't think of three better panelists to discuss that issue than JR, John Seifer, and Doug London. So anyway, get back to you. Welcome your comments.
Hey, thanks, Doug. It's good to see you and good to see some of my other friends on the net. I appreciate it. This is a great conversation. So I've been an Intel officer too long. Obviously, I come from more of a pessimistic perspective. I would probably take Chris's standpoint on this. I think the good part of it is that we're not ready, but we recognize we're not ready. And I think that's part of the issue. 2 years ago, I know there, at least on the DoD side of the house for Intel, there was a clarion call to change the way we view collection, especially as it relates to strategic competition. So from a SOF perspective, I still think that, just as Chris alluded to, the sort of the gray zone piece, I do think that our primary adversaries or potential adversaries or competitors or rivals, the Chinese and the Russians, do not want a conflict with the United States, but they are in conflict in certain domains, certainly the cyber domain. Witness SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline attack. So there's a variety of things that are going on right now that puts us in crisis to a certain extent, that I think the Intel community is recognizing it, but is not yet prepared. The issue of OSINT and publicly available information, that's going to be far more critical in the future, but it comes with a lot of challenges. There's no question about that. Technical intelligence is now on the rise again, when we sort of eschewed our responsibility as it related to electronic intelligence and tech int for a long period of time because of the counterterrorism activities. I think we have our own culture to contend with. We've got a variety of these mini cultures that exist in the Intel community, and certainly SOF is a very powerful culture in and of itself. These cultural barriers are going to be a challenge for us moving forward if we are truly going to have an integrated deterrence, as the department talks about, and as the White House addresses. So without going into too much detail, I think that there's a good news, bad news, Jekyll and Hyde aspect to where we are relative to the two big powers, and we're talking about China and Russia at the moment. So that's just in a nutshell. Thanks,
Well,
Doug.
thanks, Keith. I appreciate that. It looks like we're all ganging up on the general a bit. If I
I
look
love
back
ganging
on
up
it-
on Bob. Bob's my man.
Yeah. It's the only time in your career you can do that, I guess. When I look back on, 1947, when the CIA was created by the National Security Act of that year, and the years forward, and particularly in the international domain, from my perspective, the military was in strategic defense, prepared to defend the homeland. And obviously, then we evolved into the Cold War, and that changed into potentially war in Europe and war in other theaters. China actually had not yet appeared on the global stage in the way it has in the last few years. And I think in looking back at the history, and probably JR is way better historian than I am, but if I look at the role of CIA, and particularly in an overseas environment, we were the dominant life form. And I think in many respects, we even dominated the State Department and the policy people, and the ambassadors. And so there was a lot of self-subordination, I believe, that lasted all the way up until 9/11. And then everything changed, like everything else changed as a consequence of 9/11. But I think the relationships between the various communities made a dramatic change. I think a number of us on this panel, I probably have scars from the MLE wars, when we had, our SOF colleagues that decided that they were now in charge, and they were now the dominant life form, and that the other elements of national presence in an overseas environment and embassies, were less important to them, and they were taking a very unilateral, approach to things. And I think the pendulum swung hard where they were considering every place in the world to be ungoverned, and that they could operate with impunity, whether that's collection or whether that's direct action. And I think now we've seen in the great powers competition, it's going to force us back, because ungoverned space has clearly gone away. And I think we've all discovered that, working in conflict, amongst the agencies and departments, not helpful for American national security. And I think I certainly learned, the last 4 times, I got my opportunities to give a little, take a little, sacrifice some, offer support, enable others' success, have others enable my success. And we all have experienced that, I think. But the reality is we're now into an environment where it's not in the immediate aftermath of post 9/11, and perhaps the non-military side of things, becomes more predominant. And but still, if we end up having a great power competition to, transkinetic kind of situation, which would be tragic indeed, but I think, the relationships are going to be affected by where we are today and the change in mission strategically. So, perhaps, discussing what is going to have to change vis-a-vis our relationships. I think Keith mentioned, the culture, the structures, the authorities, all of that is different in the different communities. We've learned to work together. We must work together. But the reality is, we can't do it the way we used to do it, because today is not like yesterday, unfortunately. So perhaps John Cipher, career CIA officer, maybe you could offer some perspectives on the partnership and the collaboration with the U.S. military as we go into the great powers environment.
Sure. So I'm sort of speaking as, a human collector, and obviously, human is just one small piece of value add to the larger intelligence collection sort of mechanism. And so I would sort of argue, like Chris and others, that 15 years of focus on terrorism has skewed some of the incentive structures and misaligned some of the things that we need to do to take on the bigger strategic powers like China and Russia. And that's only natural, right? I mean, I think that's, again, I agree, we have the skill and talent and money and to move in the right direction. To give one example, I think we probably have more intelligence collectors in Florida than we do in Russia and China combined. We need to find a way to build that expertise, build the language skills, get people into those places, so that that we're true experts on that. The Chinese and Russians still know more about America and have more English speakers than we have speakers of their languages, for example. And I think, we're getting there, but we're behind in the world of sensors and algorithms and big data and sharing data between the different organizations. We're at a point now where, we can use OSINT and open source data much more effectively. I think we've seen this with Ukraine, that, we can use secretly acquired information, sensitive information, and then use open source information to essentially create the same picture and use that politically, up front. So we were able to put out to the world the stuff the Russians were doing that we probably learned from sensitive sources, but then we're able to put together an open source sort of intelligence report on that kind of stuff. So I think we're certainly getting there, but I suspect that we're still not sharing just sort of our internal data, which would allow those sort of big data collection systems to be even more effective. I do also think that the NCS, the CIA's clandestine service, or the DO now, failed when the DNI set up. It wanted to make the NCS collection, the CIA's collection, for sort of the place to go for human to create sort of requirements and standards and training. And we sort of dropped the ball on that. We wanted to play our game and sort of keep everybody out. And I think someone's going to have to do that more effectively. Maybe that's the DNI. I think there's been a lot of people just sort of doing it on their own. There's tons of retired guys that have their own companies that are doing training for the military and the special forces community. There's just sort of ad hoc-ism of that. But I think we all need to get up to speed on both collection and analysis as we work together and institutionalize those things.
Oh, thanks, John. In the end, and I would welcome some comments on this from JR and Doug London. But like I said in the beginning, we were the dominant life form, and CIA kind of drove everything, and nobody would ever, no one would ever take the risk. Nobody had the capability to really do military or defense human, particularly operating in CIA's spaces overseas. And now, post 9/11, we have really a recognition that SOF Intel in particular, because that's our natural partner, defense intel writ large, now legitimately has, the need to do intelligence collection prior to, transkinetics. And so then they're become operating in our battle space. And so what's the role of the COS? What's the relationship? I mean, can the military do something without having COS approval? Can the military do things, relatively unilaterally? I mean, all of that kind of thing. I know the answers to some of those questions are reserved to my comments. And I welcome some thoughts from JR and Doug London. JR, your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think, it's the classic case of, where you stand on an issue has to do with where you sit. So, I retired in 2007. And since then, I have done primarily work with the agency museum on open source history of early Cold War, but also have spent basically since 2007 to the present working as an advisor and instructor for a variety of different, mostly Army, but also just generally SOCOM collectors. The secret to the early Cold War, and I think this is something that we all need to consider, and I'll just throw this out and not go belabor it, but in the early Cold War, what you had, and I'm talking about like in the 50s, you had actually a commitment on the part of the United States for a whole of government operations focusing on the primary adversary, the Soviet Union, and then eventually the People's Republic of China. Now, when I say whole of government, I mean, I really do mean that. I mean, people think about the fact that we did a number of different covert operations in Europe during that time period. But at least for the first 3 years of those covert operations, they were actually managed at the strategic level by George Kennan at State Department. So the Office of Policy Coordination, that's the program that Wisner ran, which ran separate stations from the actual conventional espionage side of the house. Their tactical and operational activity was certainly managed by an office in the CIA, but their strategic focus was managed by George Kennan and then integrated with other State Department and other whole of government treasury efforts. So that's something to consider as we prepare for the new Cold War 2.0, which is at the strategic level, the White House and the cabinet have to decide if they're going to collaborate or cooperate on this and who's in charge. At the tactical and operational level, there is, I think, an important balance here that we have to recognize. The first one is the CIA still has the most persistent presence in the field. We are, in fact, the people who are there day in, day out with our State Department colleagues, our military colleagues, many of whom I've been involved in training and mentoring. They go in at a maximum of 179 days. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't military attaches there. Of course there are. And they are assigned 2-year and 3-year assignments. But the vast majority of the operational collectors that I've been working with, they are 179-day guys, and then they go away. And hopefully they will come back in 6, 8, 10, 12 months, but not always. And that is the success of the CIA has been persistent presence. We train people, we give them language, and they keep coming. If they stay for 3 years, 4 years, and often, and particularly with the hard target languages or just generally hard languages, they keep coming back year in, year out, over and over and over again. Now, the downside of the CIA's perspective on this, and this is just something that this is my 2 cents on this, is we have always our operating directive, the station tasking has always been at the strategic level. That's because we're strategic collectors. The problem is that the vast majority of the stuff that I have seen in the field at the trench level, and I worked at the trenches. I wasn't a senior in any way, shape, or form, but at the trench level, the vast majority of the collection requirements that I have been approached during the Gulf War by G2s in the various services, or for that matter in Afghanistan or Iraq, or subsequently, those folks are really interested in operational collection. Well, the problem is that if we're not tasked with operational collection, we're not going to do operational collection. And that's something that from a strategic or from a headquarters standpoint, we have to leverage out and decide who's going to do the operational collection and how's that going to be done. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, good. Thanks, JR. Doug London, your thoughts?
Well, first, it's great to be among this iconic group of personalities where I'm the quiet and retiring one. So I get to amplify the brilliance as opposed to probably come up with any on my own. But I believe that the IC, and I'm get away from these generic things, the CIA, it's in CIA's blood and DNA to do strategic competition, to do great power competition. I mean, that is the bread and butter. It's how we train. And for us, the agency, conflict zones were the exception. And I think for SOF, it really is more of the rules. So CIA was doing a lot more of the adapting to the new environment and the new relationships, I think, than SOF had to do. And they were perhaps in a more comfortable place. As we look at strategic competition, again, getting that bread and butter, the challenges that I think SOF will face which where the agency more naturally inclined towards is working with cover, significantly difficult counterintelligence environments, and liaison equities. And some of this is because of perspective. And I have the good fortune to do a fair bit of training for SOCOM elements, and I get to see how they train. And I don't necessarily know that they are yet training how they fight in intel as they are training how they expect to fight in the combat zone, and even a combat zone with China. They're training how they fight for, God forbid, a conflict with the great powers, right? But on the intel, they still tend to be in a world where they don't see cover necessarily as anything but sometimes a hassle or a defensive tool, where agency officers look to manipulate cover more offensively. In terms of counterintelligence, there's views I see among our SOF partners on the intel side where they look at some environments as permissive and non-permissive. There's no such thing as a permissive environment to a CIA officer. There's always going to be CI, complications, risk, and liaison equities. You certainly don't want to tick off your host. And then that then gets to that lack of freedom that CIA knows it has to just do whatever it wants, and there's no necessarily penalty or one we could get out of, where the equities with the host government, I think, because we're so much more plugged into the country mission, we sometimes see the bigger picture and we see the yin and yang and the give and the take. So as we move forward, I think the agency has to make up for a fair bit of underinvestment as we fought the war on terrorism. Even though our fundamental training is geared towards strategic competition, we found ourselves fighting today's war then, which was mostly, conflict zones, find, fix, finish, and a lack of investment in such things as ubiquitous technical surveillance that we're all facing, how to manipulate these new CI environments. And again, for us, the M word is a big one. It's always about manipulation. What can we do with it, and how can we make the most of it? We're going to be living in a largely Title 50 world in strategic competition. And the military has been very used to SOF dealing with that Title 10 world. And, Doug Wise referred to that, in which they basically had the authorization for the use of military force to look at the entire world as their space. And from a CT perspective, there may be some credence to that, but their mission in this world, in the Title 50 world, it's most likely going to take place, is going to be changing as well. And just my exposure to SOF requirements, and to JR's point, tend to be tactical because that's what they're doing. They need to enable their success if the balloon goes up, and they need to blow up bridges or non-combatant evacuation, the American community, the traditional SOF missions. So I don't see difficulties in the relationship getting poisoned in any way. I think, and I know I'm maybe jumping ahead, the years of working together has created understandings, relationships, and I like to believe mutual respect going both ways that I think will bridge it. But I think the agency will first have to kind of strengthen itself, though I've been really pleased at some of the reports we see declassified or, God forbid, leaked, suggesting, we're still doing it. We're collecting some really good secrets out there. And I think it's going to get better as we continue to up our ante for investing in this new fight, if you would. But I think the agency is going to have to be cognizant of its role in enabling SOF in these environments, as opposed to go, okay, you're playing in our world now, and you're just going to have to toe the line. Because I don't think that does anybody any good. And I don't think that will happen because of these 20 years of positive, and I would say increasingly positive, because probably the first years weren't that positive, but they got better and better as time went on.
Well, I think thanks. And Chris Costa, I'm going to go to you next. Back in the Cold War days, JR's Cold War days, I think as we entered into the post 9/11 world, the military had less SOCOM. It didn't exist at the time, in the way it is today. But, I think CIA had to do most of the adaptation because it pushed us into a more tactical collector role, at least from my own experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think the military actually had less of an adaptation. Now that we're entering into great powers competition, to what a number of you said, CIA is in its happy place. We don't have to make as much of an adaptation because China and Russia are strategic targets. I think US SOCOM, however, has to now make its adaptation, and significant indeed, to figure out, what is their role in the great power competition. And I think that's the seminal question. What is the role for SOF and what's the role for SOF Intel? Because in the end, how does the collaboration and the cooperation change, or what form does it take, will be driven by the role that SOF sees itself playing now in our battle space, our strategic battle space. And so I think the way the friendship, the partnership, and the collaboration will unfold will in great measure be how SOF wants to play in the intelligence business, how SOF wants to play in the operational business. So some thoughts from you, Chris, on that?
Yeah, so mindful that I'm not being needlessly provocative, I want to use an intelligence officer from CIA. I think all of us know Mark Polymeropoulos. Mark offers a great hypothetical vignette, which I think is important for us to reflect on. He talks about the SOF operator overseas working closely with the station, that the mission is to illuminate a network of Chinese spies where the finish isn't going to be kinetic. It's going to be a target packet that goes from a SOF operator to a CIA station chief or a deputy chief somewhere overseas. And that's the future paradigm, where we have to break from the parochialism in the IC. We're looking back at the Cold War, and we're trying to imprint that on great power competition. This is very different, in my humble opinion. It is far-reaching. We're talking about Russia, China, Iran. We're talking about plenty of fight for both the IC and SOF. And we have to, I think, and I'm very respectful of authorities, but at the same time, I will tell you, again, having worked operationally with at least two people on this panel, we never had discussions on authorities. We both had agreements on how to conduct operations cooperatively. Frankly, the best SOF operators out there were very mindful of authorities, but didn't have to engage in those discussions overseas. And also at a policy level, the Title 10, Title 50 debate is overwrought. In my opinion, it's not worth spending too much time on that. We should be mindful of it. But from a policy standpoint, nobody talked about Title 50 and Title 10 other than some lawyers. What we wanted is mission impact. And I think that's the way we have to look at great power competition. We have to be complementary, but parochialism is our Achilles heel. And let me just give another example. MI6, so we're talking about foreign partners. MI6 has partnered very closely with SBS and SAS, actually SAS, as far as I know, according to open source reporting. They are working cooperatively on countering malign Chinese and Russian actors globally. I'm sure that some of these authorities fights play out in the UK, and maybe SOF is the junior partner. But at the end of the day, the UK has recognized that we have a big fight and we have to be complementary in our capabilities and move beyond a Cold War paradigm, or avoid reflecting back to Cold War paradigm. This is a completely different fight, in my opinion. And I think that that's what we should be mindful of. And parochialism, again, to put a finer point on it, that is our greatest vulnerability. We have to figure out how to be more complementary.
Chris, thanks. Bob and Keith, you all have operated and you've led through all of this change from, the Cold War all the way up to today. What are your thoughts on what are the challenges? And am I right when I say that CIA is in its happy place and perhaps maybe SOF Intel needs to do more adaptation than CIA does? And then I'll suggest that John Cipher offer a perspective on, what would he as a career CIA human say about my comments. But anyway, Bob, some thoughts to you as you have lived this and are now part of the leading, the community to change to the great powers competition.
Thanks, Doug. I agreed with Chris's comments about the necessity for us, working in a complementary manner with each other. I think there's tools and resources that both CIA and SOF Intel bring to various challenges that our nations will face around the world. I also, using a command relationship as far as how we would work together, in some places in the world, we were the supported element, and in the IC and the CIA were supporting of some of our stuff, depending on where we were at, declared theaters of active armed conflict and such. But in other places, our experience, we were supporting your team. And when we were doing CT operations in other places, Yemen, Horn of Africa, that sort of thing. And what the biggest advantage we achieved is the relationships, as Chris mentioned, that we've established over these years. And we know how our teams work. We know how our teams can work together. And I think that will be helpful going forward. So I'm an optimist, as we make this transition to strategic competition. I think we can work together. Soldiering and intel are both team sports, and we need to work as team players. And again, I would minimize the Title 10, Title 50 as well, because that can be a wall that we put up that's not necessary, and because we can bring skills and capabilities that complement the overall effort, because we're all working for the same nation. So again, I think we can do well together. And now the biggest challenge on the SOF Intel side is getting out of the mindsets of counterinsurgency and what we were able to do in those types of environments, and focusing now on a more strategic level and how we can focus on how we can assist our CIA colleagues. But Keith, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Yeah, I would generally agree with what you just said. I do think, going back to what Doug was talking about, I think we're in a good place as it relates to the CIA and SOF. I think maybe the broader community has got some issues to contend with, but I think the relationship that has been forged over the last 20 years of conflict, I think is really solid, to tell you the truth. And I think it's all based on cooperation and deconfliction of activities on the ground. That took time to do that. But my time in Iraq was I spent a significant amount of time with CIA personnel on the ground, and I couldn't have done my job without them. But in turn, I think it was a mutually supported relationship. I was providing them information based on the amount of interactions that I was having with seniors on the ground in Iraq. So I think that trust has been established predominantly between SOF and the CIA. So I think we're in pretty good shape there. I do think that what's going to end up happening, I think, moving forward, is this issue of it's not persistent presence on the ground necessarily, but it's in the information sphere, and that's going to be a huge issue that we're all going to have to deal with, and develop lanes in the road and some significant deconfliction, a deconfliction apparatus as it relates to who's operating in that sphere. We talked about open source intelligence. But the SOF operators want to fulfill their responsibilities inside those networks, and I think that creates a challenge, rightfully so. And I think the CIA is in there, NSA is in there, FBI is in there, and that's going to be the next what could be considered an ungoverned space to a certain extent. So. I think that's really the conversation that needs to happen next, is how do we work in that virtual or digital environment?
Good comments. The point that several of you have made is look what we got out of the 9/11 post 9/11 experience. We got a lot of distillation of mythology out of our respective communities. We got mutual respect. We had a tremendous attitude, I think, on both sides for the most part, on enabling each other's success, as Bob said just a few minutes ago. But that was at a time when we had thousands of officers engaged with each other, both out of both communities, the SOF community as well as the IC. We had tremendous investment in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so you had young officers that cycled through there and learned these lessons and learned how to get along and learned how to enable each other's success and learned how to work through the cultural, procedural, structural authorities differences. And you know, shared mission, shared risk kind of helps to bond everybody together. But that's not the way it is today. In fact, we have very few officers and very few leaders who are going to have those experiences that all of us on this panel had. So I'm not sure that the future is going to be good in terms of relationships. And let me just pose to John Cipher and then to Doug London, you know, when a military colleague comes to you as a chief of station, you know, and proposes an initiative, you know, it's one of three things. Either one, it'll be a great thing and really help out. It'll be no impact to me at all, go do your thing, or it'll going to be something that'll just make my life very complicated as a chief of station. So it'll be one of those three things. And then how you deal with all of those three things will be on your attitude towards your military colleague. It'll turn on your experiences that you've had, your trust and confidence, as some of you have mentioned in here, the trust is developed over the post 9/11 period. But, you know, when our military colleague comes to us as chiefs of station, you know, how do we handle all three of those, any one of those three alternatives? So John, perhaps some thoughts to you, and then after Doug London, then I'll go back to JR to give us some comments on this.
Yeah, sure. It's a hard one. And I think some of it comes back to the things that you guys have talked about before. I mean, JR mentioned the thing, if you're coming into town for 3 months or 6 months, that makes it much harder. I mean, I think a lot of us here benefited by over time developing relationships. So we don't have to worry about Title 10, Title 50, all those things, because we trust each other, because we've worked together and learned. Whereas if I'm in a station, I've been there for 3 years and someone comes in and they're going to be there for a couple months and they're going to go out on the street and do something, do I have confidence that they know how to operate on the street, that they can go out there, that they can do that? And if they're going to leave, the person who comes in to do it behind them has those kind of things. You know, one of the things that I saw that I think we need to sort of figure out in stations overseas, not war zones, is oftentimes when the military collector comes out there to talk about, they make it clear that they don't work for the ambassador, they work for some general or admiral back at PACOM or whatever it is. And that's a real problem when we, the COS, who are tied to the ambassador, go to the ambassador to explain we have military colleagues on the street, we have confidence that they have the training to do the job and do this type of thing. But the ambassador sort of understands that, well, this person doesn't report through my chain. I think the military has to figure out a way to fix that, because essentially we in the CIA we're used to working with the ambassadors, but also at the end of the day, we do work for the ambassador. We figure out a way to deal with them on the bigger picture issues. But my day to day, I'm not trying to tell him everything or tell her everything or you know, do exactly what they want. I work for the, you know, the DNI, the director of CIA, these other kind of places. The military has to figure that out too, so they don't have this sort of, I'm sorry, sir, I don't work through the ambassador chain, I work through, you know, Commander PACOM thing, because I think it creates problems that we don't need to have. The other one had to do, again, what JR said about coming in for a short period of time, this training collectors at a level of, you know, your level 1 or your level 2, or, you know, I can do some sort of collection, but not other sort of collection. If we're going to be operating in spaces where we're dealing with the Russians and Chinese, that game doesn't play. Like their counterintelligence, their counterespionage, their ability to deal with things. If we're going to have people traveling in those countries, you either do it, you know, full on and know exactly what you're doing. You have excellent cover, you have excellent knowledge, excellent language, you understand the counterintelligence implications, or you don't. We can't sort of halfway that type of thing. And so I think that's going to be a thing we're going to have to move, you know, forward with a little bit. And the thing that Keith said too, I think there's some really good points there, that some of the military's experience on counterinsurgency and in the virtual world, that's something that we can sort of now start to really push forward. The agency, even though we've worked in China and Russia for all these kind of years, we haven't been as effective on the whole sort of political warfare, disinformation, deception part of the world. We're good at it. We understand the Russians do that, but that's an area where I think we as a country have to pull our resources together, because China and Russia are looking to damage the United States, not just run spy operations. And I think we have skill sets that are in the military that can really benefit what we have in sort of just raw intelligence community.
Great. Mr. London, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'm going to piggyback on a bunch of what John said. So I think the SOF folks who come out to the field in the non-conflict zones really have a lot of challenges. And it kind of starts with their backgrounds. And to JR's point, these are folks that are out for limited periods of time. And spying, I think, is very experientially based. You get all this training, and until you do it and do it a number of times in a number of places, it takes a while to kind of build up that journeyman capacity. So on the operator side, with the SOF folks that I've had come out to the Title 50 field, non-conflict zone field, these are generally senior enlisted. They've got ASOT level 3, maybe, right? Which is their top tier, I think, for human training. But most all of them I had the fortune to work with were converted door kickers. They started out in usually big army. They went to special forces. They got either voluntold into the intel world, as my SOF colleagues will say, or based on disabilities or injuries, they found themselves in that world. So they don't necessarily have a great deal of traditional, what we call CIA, traditional operational experience. Second tour, third tour. As my first COS said, you're a junior officer until your third tour. And in some respects, based on the experiential component, there was something to that, but he's just mean anyway. But these folks are trying to do something that they may not be most comfortable with. Their training in ASOT level 3, if they haven't gone through the farm, is different, and reflects usually the experiences of their instructors, which is very counterinsurgency heavy, very much for their mind permissive CI environments and such like that. And sometimes with the old crusty ones who are the trainers, a bit of the parochial thing, like Chris was mentioning. So I would have these folks come out, and my job, I think, is to enable their success. And to Doug's point, it's exactly that. It's like, this is great, this is easy, this is not going to bother me, or oh my God, what am I going to do about this? But I need to find a way to help them, make them work, because otherwise I'm going to be on a telephone call the next day from their command. And that's the other piece. They're under a different kind of pressure than CIA officers. These folks are out there as singletons, maybe 2 of them, whatever. They're small groups, right? They're used to one operating in a team, operating in a safe kind of family environment in a conflict zone, not safe from guns and bombs going off, but safe kind of like in terms of chain of command, what are my lanes in the road and such like that. And now they're under all these pressures. They do have their chain of command telling them, well, you got to do this, and you got to tell the COS, this is how it's going to be, because it's our mission. And to Chris's point, okay, they don't come out necessarily preaching Title 10, but they're under pressure from their chains of command to comply with that. They are, more often than not, well-intentioned. They want to do the right thing. They don't want to get anybody mad at them. They do want to succeed. They're not necessarily prepared. You're trying to teach them. You're kind of teaching in role, right? At the same time as you're enabling them, because that's part of our responsibility. And to John Cypher's point, so that we're confident that, oh my God, it's 2 a.m. Is everything okay? So they have all sorts of pressures. It's better for the agency to try to make them successful and be cognizant of that. But there are times where it is okay. Well, the greatest thing you could do here as SOF operator is you go in that corner and work with, Jim or Teresa and study this, because you just want to keep them from doing anything that's going to blow up in their faces and yours. I actually have found the targeters and the analysts from SOF a lot easier, because they're designed to integrate into station. And a lot of their mission is to learn and bring back skills and such like that, where the operator has a set, these are the things you're supposed to accomplish. To JR points and John's point, they're probably part of a pipeline, or to try to get a pipeline going where they'll be replaced. and they don't necessarily transfer their experiences as well, because once again, that pipeline I started with, okay, this person doesn't have a lot of experience, they're under great pressures, I got to enable and teach them, or have one of the other officers in station do so. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and I think it's going to go to SOF's responsibility to adjust their pipelines for how they draw these people on to the intel side. I think it goes to the training, and I think it goes to the trainers that they're having working with these folks, so they are better prepared from the outset to succeed in Title 50 land and to work with station as, an enabler and supporter and teacher. So I think it's going to take a little time. Not disagreeing with Bob or anybody here, that they're on the right path. They have the right intentions, but some of those pieces are going to fall into place. And the military is huge for CIA anyway. It's huge, right? So things to us tend to take a little longer, where because we're kind of smaller, we could kind of adapt and align quicker. So yeah, I'm optimistic over the future, but I'm worrying about the first bumps in the road as we start moving down the road.
Good comments. And I'd like to give a chance for Bob, Keith, and Chris to comment. If you three gentlemen, and we'll go to Bob first, if you three gentlemen had, senior leaders in the SOF community sitting in front of you, and you were giving them some advice as to how to deal with some of these issues that we talked about, Bob, what would you tell them? How about, their role in the great powers competition? Would you tell them and how to help them adapt, and particularly how to work with us in the IC and CIA in particular?
Yeah, I would tell them take all commands from the tower. Okay, and what that means is the ambassador's in charge of the U.S. overall effort in that particular country. The COS is the senior intel officer in that country. So if we can contribute to the COS's efforts, and Doug mentioned the integration of into the station there. We had that embassy targeting officer program at JSOC when I was there, and that was generally received well by all the COSs that we were supporting. But the guidance given to those largely analysts, as Doug rightly identified, they were there. They were told, you're there to work for that station chief and to move information and give him or her what we can to assist them, as our network was tracking folks around the world. And if that bad guy that we were tracking is going to be coming through their area of operations, that country, let them know. So I think that type of integration works well, especially if they have the clear guidance that they're there to support the station. On the analytical side, on the operator side, when they go to a country, again, it's the same thing. If it's not a declared theater of active armed conflict, the ambassador is in charge, and the COS is a senior intel officer. So the approach that worked well in the past, at least in my experience, and Keith and Chris can elaborate on this, is before we did anything, we showed up and briefed the COS. And then if the COS thought we needed to brief the ambassador, then we would go brief the ambassador. And then if the COS approved it, then we would move forward under the guidance of the COS. If the COS said no, absolutely not in this country, then it was dead on arrival. So anyway, that was the way we approached it in the past with some success. And if I were speaking to my buddies that are in charge now and still wearing the uniform, that's exactly what I'd recommend to them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Keith, what do you have?
Yeah, these are all great points. And there is an argument to be made that, it's all about training and experience. And that's a constant challenge across the board. And I'm glad Chris is going to go after me, because he probably remembers a couple of occasions where, the SOCOM commander had to respond directly to a chief of mission, an ambassador in a country in which SOF was operating, and things went somewhat awry. So all I can tell you is that at SOCOM, there is an ambassador orientation course We try to get any ambassador who's identified to go forward before he does, or well within the time that he does arrive at a station. We brief him, and the commander, every commander comes in and says, we don't do anything without your knowledge. You're in charge. I'm not in charge. So now we do have this issue of the whole Title 10, Title 50 thing. I think sometimes we end up focusing too much on that. I really do think that they're complementary and not mutually exclusive. The SecDef does have Title 50 authorities. I think the bigger issue ends up becoming from the TSOC perspective, the Theater Special Operations Commands, when they are active in their regions at the behest of a geographic combatant commander. And they're operating under these funding authorities, which are like 1202, 1204, 1206, 333, 127 Echo, all of these variety of things. And sometimes it does get confusing as to what their responsibilities are once they get on the ground. But I do think that this issue of the cooperation, the collaboration, the deconfliction, as I mentioned earlier, which is huge, I think that's been somewhat inculcated in most of our operators before they go into a country, and certainly when they are reintroduced into that country, that you are really obligated to ensure that you fully communicate, unambiguous communication with the chief of station and the chief of mission there. You don't do anything that is outside of their purview. We had those issues certainly 10 years ago, up till about 10, maybe even 15 years ago. We had a lot of problems there, but I think over the course of the last, I would say 5 to 8 years, we've gone to great lengths to try to ensure that that doesn't occur. So I'll go over to Chris and see if he can fill in some of the blanks from the operational standpoint.
No, great thoughts from both Keith and Bob, everyone really. So I'll just add a couple points. First of all, I have made a latter part of my career was spent going out and addressing crises that were caused basically by tactical errors in the field or counterintelligence issues related to operations. And Keith alludes to one, can't talk about the details, certainly, but a couple key points that I took into those fights. First of all, you've got to hold your, somebody else alluded to it, you've got to maintain and know who it is that you represent. At the same time, you have to go into those fights with some humility, a lot of humility in many cases, but at the same time, it's about cross-cultural communications. What's important to the people who feel like their operations have been disrupted by your mistakes? What are they thinking about? What are their concerns? You need to go into the operational environment knowing that. Know the history and the point that John made about counterintelligence environment. Knowing what that CIA, or I'm sorry, the CI environment is absolutely crucial. Being fluent in the threat environment and then being able to articulate that. Know your own operations so you can walk through what your authorities were, what your authorities were not, what was erroneously reported and what is correct. It takes a lot of humility. In many cases, some of what was reported out of these gaffes is incorrect. You have to correct the record, but once cables fly, once seniors start talking, it is really hard to walk back. So you have to really attack these problems with a high dose of humility. And I think the cross-cultural communications is absolutely crucial. Understanding what's important to the Department of State, understanding what's important to CIA, and just working through those issues. And I will tell you, just as a footnote, all of the people that were very upset at the end of as Keith alluded to, an operational gaffe that took place. All of those individuals ended up sitting in on my meetings when I was running the counterterrorism security group. And I will tell you, none of them lacked an appreciation for the position I had been in at SOCOM working through these issues. And it was very collegial in the end because we didn't allow things to get emotional. at least the people that work through these issues. And Doug Wise used to tell me, he counseled me in the 1990s, you react, you don't overreact. And that's really was Doug's temperament. And not everyone is like that. So you just have to sometimes just bear it.
Good comments. I was recently privileged to be a chief of station role player in a SOCOM exercise. It was about a month and a half ago, so relatively contemporary experience. It was clear to me that as the teams came to me as a chief of station, and it was kind of reflective of what all of you have said, they recognized that getting the COS on board and getting the ambassador on board was a no-fail mission, that none of the prep, none of the IPB, none of the research, none of the rehearsals, none of the years of skill acquiring training, none of that could be applied if you didn't get the COS on board and didn't get the ambassador on board. And that is a tough lesson to learn, I think, when you come from the military community, which is thinking that, that they are in charge and everybody else is a supporting command. I mean, that's just the history, and I understand that. I did 20 years in the military, so I get that. But I was very comforted by the fact that these young leaders in SOCOM recognized that there was an important and critical role for COS to play. I think some still believe that they'll comply, but they don't really understand that. But that's all you need. All you need is compliance. You don't need to, total embracing and involvement in that. But you just need to have somebody that behaves that way, even if they don't believe it. And I think in the end, the U.S. foreign policy in that country pre-kinetics, I think the CIA's national role, and again, the other thing that I've discovered is that these teams will show up with a very narrowly focused mission. And it takes a little bit, and the COS has to understand that the COS has an education and training and crew, whether it's one individual or whether it's a team of people. I help them understand my world, and I help them understand the things that are important to me, so that they can view my behavior like I will view theirs, and not impute evil to it, but understand that I have obligations and responsibilities. I need to understand, I think, as John Cipher mentioned, that they have obligations and responsibilities, through chains that are different than mine. And I think if all of us have an opportunity to become more enlightened, more aware, more educated, and again, as I said earlier, dispel mythology and become more educated and more appreciative and more respectful, I think we'll all be in a much better position to be mutually supportive, to say the least. And so I took great comfort in the fact that SOCOM clearly, as Bob Walter has said, and I think I can attribute this to really Admiral McRaven. I think it began in his time frame, where he really, impressed upon his command that the role of the ambassador is important and it's critical, and we will not do anything. I'm sure there are rare exceptions, but we will not do anything that the ambassador hasn't approved, because in the end, the ambassador will be there like the chief of station, everybody else in the embassy. They'll be there before this team shows up. They'll be there while the team shows up, and they'll be there after the team. We be there before, we be there while, we be there after. And so that is also an important aspect of education between the ambassador and the embassy staff and the COS to the team. And again, the team understands that they're there for an important purpose. They are under an obligation to accomplish the mission. It's not work, it's not a job, not a task for the military, it's a mission. And so I found it to be, very encouraging. The military colleagues, honor and the pleasure and the privilege of working with a short month and a half ago had really embraced this, and we're really walking the talk. I found that to be very, very comforting, to say the least. So let me just open it up to the panel to offer up. I mean, I've spoken a lot, and I've kind of managed the flow of this, and I know that ThinkJSOU wanted this to be just a bunch of bunch of people sitting around a table in a bar, old colleagues talking about issues that they believe is important. So perhaps maybe open the floor. John Cipher, we'll start with you, and we can cross-talk if you want. You can cross-examine, but just some random thoughts on this general topic from you, John.
One thing I would say is, we're focused sort of on like what the special operations community needs to do to get in here, but we also have to, CIA has to make a lot of changes in the way it does business as well. I mean, leadership training at the CIA, I found when you get to the senior ranks, the general level ranks, then you do lots of cross training. You go out to military commands, you go to State Department, you go all these NSA, you sort of learn what's important to them. And you're sort of, when you're a chief station, by that point, you're much more effective in understanding sort of the bigger picture and your role in it. But we have a ton of chief of stations overseas who don't get any of that training, that they come up through a culture that's about, recruiting sources. If you're a good source recruiter, you sort of move up in our system, and then you find yourself, the chief in Moldova or the chief of a small station. You still have to do that role of deconflicting, working with the military, working with others, and it might be harder for you because you're focused sort of on your work. You haven't had this experience of sort of working and realizing sort of how these bigger issues do. So I think the agency has to do a better job of preparing and training its people, because if you want the COS to be the person that makes these kind of calls, then they need to be truly ready to do that. The CIA also has to get much more better at taking, collection is going to be key across all of these different agencies. And if the CIA wants people to be a bit able to operate in places like Russia, China, and that, we've got to put a lot more resources, a lot more time into training, a lot more working with our counterparts, rather than just, letting a few into the farm and saying, okay, that's fine. I mean, a lot of our fellow colleagues are making lots of money as retired people training military units. I mean, the agency should be doing a lot more of that itself, rather than just letting sort of companies do that kind of thing. And the agency has to change its own sort of internal incentive structures. We all grew up, the way you got ahead in CIA, the way you got promoted, the way you made things is recruitments, number of recruitments. And if we're going to take on big challenges like Russia, China, Iran, these type of things, recruiting a whole bunch of Africans so that you can say that I've done a bunch of recruitment so I can get promoted is not necessarily the way that we're going to succeed in the future. We need to figure out ways to operate in places that, have incredible sensors and ability to watch us. And you're going to have, ability to manage among institutions. You're going to have the ability to operate in places where, there's big data and there's cameras and all these other kind of things. And spend more time managing some of the sources we have, and, a better job of going after those few sources, those top level sources that can really be game changers for us, rather than. And so, yes, we always have to be able to be, skilled at recruitment, but I think it's skewed that way in the CIA. So the CIA has to make a lot of changes if it's going to, play the role of big brother in the intelligence collection in these places like China, Russia, et cetera.
I think it is important. I think CIA does have to make some cultural changes. And while you were talking about the method of getting ahead in CIA, you forgot about the critical role that undermining your competitors plays in that getting promoted as well. But I point all of which you just made, I actually make to my military colleagues when I'm out with them in the field these days. As a wretched pensioner, as JR would say. And I say, look, the military is the greatest leadership development machine. The US military is the greatest leadership development machine in the history of the human race. CIA often views leadership training as a cost rather than as an investment. And we also agree that if you're a dynamite recruiter, you're just genetically predisposed to being a dynamite leader of other dynamite recruiters. And I think the record allows me to say that doesn't always work in every case. There is a little bit of development and nurturing and polishing the diamond and, the role to play for sure. But anyway, some good comments. Who else? Jump in.
I think someone mentioned before, they talked about George Kennan, they talked about containment, and they talked about this grand strategy that we had during the Cold War. And that's something that, although we've got a lot of documents and we've got, these defense intelligence strategies that come out, and we've got a variety of other things that are published, it doesn't really connote a whole of nation strategy against, let's say, our number one potential adversary, certainly our number one rival, which is China. It's the insidious entrenchment of the Chinese just about everywhere, including inside our own networks, inside our own nation. And that's going to create a problem for us related to force projection if we want to move to the Pacific in any way, shape, or form. So I do think that there really needs to be a global strategy, probably a global intelligence strategy on China. It's got to be more of a whole of government issue because we're already in political warfare and economic warfare, I think, as it relates to the Chinese, and we've got to get cracking on it. Now, having said that, we talk about integrated deterrence, but it also has to be assurance. And that's part of this whole messaging strategy that we really have talked about quite a bit. And I know the Joint MISO Web Ops Center has been established at SOCOM. There's the Algorithmic Warfare Task Force. There's the JAIC, which is artificial intelligence. A lot of these things have been established to sort of get after the ability to influence our rivals and remain in competition. And I do think that we're not moving fast enough. And then there's not this assurance piece. And we saw that play out with the Russians in particular. I spent my last 2 years at NORTHCOM, NORAD and NORTHCOM, where deterrence was paramount. And the concern always was how the Russians were reacting to us. And when I say us, I mean us and our NATO allies. And it was really detrimental. And now we're in this situation where the Russians have invaded Ukraine. But before that, I think my commander at the time, he's still the commander of NORTHCOM, General Van Herk, often would say, what are we conveying to the Russians and how are they receiving our message? And I think that he would say that, it's deterrence, but it's also assurance, assuring them we don't mean them harm. We don't want to go into conflict. And then there's this issue finally about the common picture as we talk about across the intelligence community. What does that really mean? It means, you have to connect these common data sets that we do have in this big data environment, which is a challenge. It's a challenge from a security perspective, information assurance perspective, a variety of things. But in order to achieve interoperability, we're going to have to do a better job of connecting our networks. We rely on the intel community side of it. We more on the DoD side, we rely on JWICS, and JWICS is never meant to be a warfighting network, but it is indeed just that, because it's relatively dependable. And then the last thing I would say is we got to do a better job at warning, predictive analysis, and assessment. And we've talked about that quite a bit the last few years, but I'm not sure we're meeting the mark. Everyone recognizes these things across the community and certainly across special operations, but we just need to invest more heavily in it. We need to really put our money where our mouth is as it relates to some of these things that need to happen if we're going to go effectively against certainly the Chinese. That's just my 2 cents. Thanks.
So I'll pop in if you all don't mind. Following up on stuff all y'all saying, one of the ironies I always found in the agency was that for case officers anyway, we are like conditioned and trained to be looking multiple steps down the road, right? It's all about shaping, manipulating, pushing down the future to get to these ultimate goals. But as an organization, I found that we're often chasing the shiny light. So, to point y'all are making, and John Cipher made some of these points, and Keith about looking ahead and the future. Right now, the agency is like, pulling everybody for China, to some extent, Russia, right? So that's everything. And just like during the CT war, we pulled people from doing CE stuff or, LA whimsy stuff. I mean, it's always this like, student body left, student body right. And, using the Doug Wise quote, then a lot of it is overreaction. And a lot of it is like, okay, we've got to please our superiors right now. So I think the agency, at least I can speak to directly, has struggled with having some freedom to be looking at the emerging challenges. And I think that hurt us a bit in terms of tradecraft. I mentioned it earlier during the war on terror. We really didn't invest as much in the technology, to Keith's point and such like that, dealing with ubiquitous technical surveillance, dealing with the changing landscape in which we're operating and the careers we're nurturing. So it's kind of tough when you're always in the situation where you're playing catch up. And I certainly get the sentiment from colleagues and such that we're playing catch up a bit on China, right? To kind of catch up to be able to, have the impact and effect we need to. We sort of neglected Russia to an extent for a while. We never went away, but we certainly were investing less in that landscape. Clearly we did enough because we've been getting some good intelligence, but maybe some opportunities lost. So I think that's incumbent on leadership to help us get the space to be prepared, to trend with the current threats, but to also be always posturing ourselves for the next one and the change in the landscape. And that's very much leadership. And I know that's very much, it's often political because of the tremendous pressures our leaders face from above. They want solutions now. They want to address this problem now. I mean, our whole country is structured on 4-year and 2-year rotations of our political leadership. And that certainly filters down to the institutions, which then always have to react to that. So, to John's point, John Seif's point, a lot of it is about training, but preserving the ability to train, preserve the ability to innovate, preserve the ability to be looking down the road. So often I've found folks thrust in these positions where, okay, you've got to fix this, right? We've got to fix COVCOM, right? Covert communications. We've got to fix tradecraft, whatever it is. And because of the pressure, it's often a modular solution, a Band-Aid, if you would. Instead of having the freedom to go ahead and tear something apart and start all over again and really be crazy, innovative and creative, which I know the agency historically has been great at. We've got brilliant people. We've come up with amazing toys and gadgets and tradecraft. Burton Gerber, I still teach with that at Georgetown. Gerber was a revolutionary in the 70s and 80s for the kinds of things he was doing in the Soviet Union. Let's meet these agents in person. Oh my God. I mean, that's the kind of freedom and spirit we need. And maybe we have to do it a little bit more because technology on the other side means everybody's into everybody else's business. There's no space to hide, to work on some things, to innovate some things. So I guess that's where I look to leadership from the political leadership on down throughout the IC and across DOD to consider that we may have to trudge along a little bit to preserve our ability to be innovative and to be looking several steps ahead. So,
Doug, just to give an example, when I was teaching at the farm when the Balkan War sort of broke out, and there was a whole class of people, that were getting ready to go to learn Chinese and Korean and Russian and German and all the. They said, "Oh my God, this war's broken out. We need everybody to learn Albanian because of what's happening in Kosovo." So there was a whole poor class of these sons of bitches that spent a year learning Albanian. And by the time they all learned it, the war was over and the United States government didn't give a crap anymore. And so there's a whole cadre of Albanian speakers in the embassy that never actually got to do anything with it. So maybe Doug was down there, so maybe he took advantage of some of them.
Yeah, my Albanian is what's really, really helped me a lot, except for when I was in Albania, I got it. So, Bob, some thoughts? I mean, I don't want to spoil the spontaneity, but you may have some perspective on what's been said.
Yeah, I do. And, the last 20 years or so, the situation over in Iraq and Afghanistan and the CT fight pushed our teams together. Okay, so we were pushed together and we gained experiences together over time with multiple deployments. And we'd bump into each other in Iraq and then in Afghanistan and then other garden spots around the world. And that helped mature the relationships and the trust that we were talking about earlier. But as we look forward now to the strategic competition, there's not really anything that's going to force us together. So we have to, when we're talking with our leaders that are still in the jobs, they need to be looking for ways that we can work together. Now, on the military side, we have to do those foundational things to get the skill sets necessary prior to sending someone to spend some time in Langley, or prior to spending some time with a country team, or sending someone to the farm. They have to be their own military professional. They have to go through the assessment and selections of the various tier units and have some experience there. Then once they've got to that point, and within their own skill set, what they bring to the team, then we need to look at opportunities. What does a career model look like for an SF soldier or an Intel soldier that's grown up in some of our special mission units? What does right look like? Is it, where should they start? Should they start with some time at Langley and working there, maybe for a year or two, and then go back to their roots and spend some more time honing their skills, and then maybe the next time they go to an embassy and they work with a COS someplace and see how it's working downrange, and then come back. We need to think about those sort of career progression models if we're going to have people that have built up experience, understanding, and trust with their counterparts. Because we may not be forced together in the future.
Thanks. Just to dovetail on what Bob just addressed. So let's talk about the cultural aspects of this. I think it's really important, and I have conveyed to non-commissioned officers and officers at special mission units and special forces non-commissioned officers that the definition of success has to be redefined as well. And I alluded to this in a vignette earlier. The bottom line is operators have been sated by Finnish operations for the last 2 decades. And now a Finnish might be a support to a surveillance or do something that does not satiate the average operator. That has to change culturally. Operational success is going to be very different in great power competition. And we've alluded to that. The idea that they might be supporting the interagency, CIA in particular, and doing something that is less driven by tactical operations and more strategic. And they might not even know the end result of that surveillance or that photograph. I think that's the newer paradigm for SOF. How do they change culturally to operate in that environment? I know they can do it, and I'll give a vignette without talking about the country or the place or the mission specifically, but it's obviously recognized that SOF was pretty good at illuminating networks and executing the find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, that F3EA cycle. All of that said, taking those lessons learned and applying it in a very different environment where SOF is now illuminating a very different network, but doing that with the chiefs of station's permission, actually the pull coming from a smaller a smaller station overseas with a complex environment. Those kinds of operations have played out in the background the last few years. And it's important to note that they've been very successful. So I think that kind of partnership based on the training that Bob alluded to and the cultural shift in mindset, I think it bodes well. So I wanted to make sure I offered a positive example because I think it is absolutely doable to shift from a culture that was more kinetic to a culture that is going to be and require more patience.
Well, I think it's good. It's a good point. I think the creation of the 4th Battalion, under some controversy, and kind of, focusing, and I realize that's a dynamic, structure and still under discussion and testing and that kind of thing. But I'm a real fan of that because it does provide a cadre of people that have a significant engagement with non-special forces groups. But I think to Keith's point earlier, the digitization of the battle space, and the perfect example of that is the discussion now of adding to an ODA, a cyber NCO, bespeaks to at least some sort of recognition that what Keith had to say about the importance of messaging and cyber and the role of military forces in the digital domain, probably way better topic for another Zoom session by other panel members. Would encourage David and Clarissa to think about that. But the reality is, if you had a cyber operator on an ODA, that cyber operator would not just be a hacker in an offensive sense, but would also be an intelligence collector as well. And so there's a duality there that certainly is important. So anyway, anybody else have any thoughts before
Doug?
we? Yes, sir.
Okay, so a couple of things here. The first one, going back to when you were talking about the 4th Battalion, I've spent a good chunk of the last couple of years of my life working with one of the 4th Battalions. And I think you're right that they are, it's a work in progress, but it is a very successful work in progress so far. One of the things that I say to the guys when I'm working with them, and it's really not as a trainer, more as a mentor or a background guy. And this is just I spent the better part of 14 years of my career as a TDYer. That's what I did. I hunted individuals or targets and traveled to another station, somebody else's turf, and had to convince them to work, that I wanted to work on their turf and that I wasn't going to break anything. But what I emphasize to the 4th Battalion guys is, just so you know, it's not that stations hate you. They hate all TDYers. They were just as likely to hate me as they would be to you. And I knew some of these guys. I've had station chiefs who I went through the training with who came back and said, yeah, you might break something. And I'm like, okay, let's talk, Chief, about what I'm trying to accomplish. And what can I do to work with you to make you feel more comfortable with this? So it is important for the SOF operators to understand that culturally, a station feels that all visitors are dangerous because we don't know their turf. We don't know the CI implications, as John was talking about. We don't know the day-to-day stuff, and what you said before, which is critically important, which is you're there before I get there, you're there while I'm there, and after I leave, if I'm successful or unsuccessful, doesn't really matter, you're still there. And if I've left any kind of breadcrumbs or broken bones, you're the one who has to pull all of the different kinds of resources together to fix things. So there's that part of the project, and it is in fact a function of the fact that by the time I was doing this, I was already a journeyman. So there's the problem that we're facing with a lot of the guys in the 4th Battalion is they're brand new. And they've never really worked anywhere for any long period of time. And then they go into these 90, 120, 179 cycles. And just about the time that they would begin to be more than a novice and into the journeyman world, they rotate back for a period of time. That cycle just is maddening. And it's maddening for the operators. I mean, it's maddening for them because they see their skills maturing, and then all of a sudden they're done. Now they come back, and they also always come back, and it's after the 2nd or 3rd or 4th iteration over the space of many years that they are finally on board. One other final point, which has nothing to do with anything I was talking about. When you look at the old Cold War, we tend, in this discussion so far, we tend to talk about the fact that somehow it is going to be a direct conflict between our two adversaries. But in fact, if you look at the old Cold War, we were all over, the CIA was all over the world working on projects to build liaison relationships with neutrals and to undermine relationships with spoilers. That we did that in Africa, we did it in Asia, we did it in Latin America. And I think that it's important for SOF leadership to understand that success in great power conflict isn't necessarily going to happen in the Pacific or in the European theater. It could happen all over the world. and should happen all over the world.
Good comments. We've been at this for about an hour and a half now, and I know Chris Costa had another appointment, and he's been very gracious with his time, as have all of you. Let me just ask you to just make some final comments, and then we can release you from JSOU Zoom bondage here and be on your way. So, Chris, I know you have another critical appointment, given you're the executive director of the International Spy Museum. So your final comments on this.
No, I just very much appreciate this forum. I think it's a great discussion with obviously great senior leaders from the Intel community and SOF. I think it's really important for us to continue to engage on this idea of what GPC is, what great power competition means, and at what cost. Because as I've said, my mantra has been a concern that will overcorrect, a concern that we are always sated by short-term goals and achieving what we think is important right now. And we have to take a longer view, because our adversaries certainly are. So we cannot correct on CT to the point where we're not able to respond when necessary. So I am deeply concerned that the next kind of era will be an era where we are going to have to work more collaboratively. It's not going to be just like the work that we did between the CT community and CIA. It's going to have to be the whole community. We talk about whole of government, but it's going to be ways to get at CI problems. But how can we do that with non-traditional resources? These are the questions. How can FBI think more broadly about this fight? How can they leverage the interagency? So the work and what we learned from CT has to be applied, that whole of government concept, although I hate to hear that, because we talk about that, but we never seem to achieve it. But I truly believe great power competition is going to require that level of commitment from the nation. And I really think SOF and the intelligence community, they're going to be the dominant actors in this fight. So in that respect, that is analogous to the Cold War, and of course, diplomacy. So I just think that SOF and this community, these individuals here, are the ones that have the wisdom and the experience. If we can share some of our lessons with the broader community, I think it'll go a long way.
Great, good thoughts, Keith.
Hey, thanks, Doug. Yeah, so real quickly, I think we've got the fundamental relationships in place. We've talked about, that's been forged over the last couple of decades. I think we're, at least the CIA and SOF are in that's a pretty solid relationship moving forward. But I do think it's going to end up being the digital operating environment that's going to be the challenge. And also this influence activities that are going to be global in nature. Somebody mentioned it before, especially as it relates to the Chinese and the Russians. It's really, that's where the surrogates and proxies are going to be housed. It's going to be really in the information sphere, and we're going to have to work together, very close together, to be able to influence and manage perceptions across the globe as it relates to what the Chinese are doing and what the Russians are doing. That's all I would say, but thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, John Seifer.
Sure, I won't add much. These guys are saying enough here. I think one of the things all of our organizations need to do a little better than we did during the Cold War and the war on terrorism and things is we've got to find a way to have sort of a little bit longer term incentives for our young officers as they work their way up to the thing where we are so focused on, politically we get focused on sort of the issue of the day, and also our systems are always focused on promotion, on specific things to get people up. And if we're going to compete on the bigger scale with Russians, Chinese, and others, we need to find a way that people can develop expertise and still move through a system and get promoted. So allowing people to, military people to be in places longer than 90 days, maybe be several years, the time to take out and learn a language, to have language skills. I mean, we fought in Afghanistan for, 15 years, 20 years, and nobody learned the goddamn language. Like this sort of a problem. So I think we need to find a way inside with our services to build expertise that we can use, further on down the line.
Got it. JR.
I don't really have anything else to say. What John just said is, I'm one of those guys who was too stubborn to learn anything but one language and stuck with it for 22 years. So it's possible to succeed. What has to happen is you have to be encouraged to do that, and to have bosses who are willing to say, we need people who are going to be focused on these same targets over and over again. Certainly when we started, when all of us started our careers, there was a Russia house, there were Chinese language experts who were going to go all over the world and do nothing but one thing. So I think we should be able to pull that off. We just need the willingness, the diligence to follow through on that. That's it for me.
Okay, great. Thanks. Doug London.
So to reflect Bob's optimism and some of Chris's comments about, the short-term pressures and goals, I'm going to actually express optimism in things that JR was talking about, that the landscape's real different right now. This using all our tools of power holistically, this hybrid warfare that we're dealing with, the information age, as Keith is talking about. I see signs of that in the CIA specifically and in the military when I provide them for support. And I think recognizing how complex the landscape is critical, and training in that direction. And to John Cypher's point, I would like to see on the human front, CIA really step up as the national human manager, which is its charter, and bring these components together and weaponize them in an operational way for the greater human community. And it's been a pleasure being on the same panel with all of you guys.
Great. Doug the Younger. General, you bring us home.
Thanks, Doug. My message is to the JSOU students that actually watch this video at some point in the future. I've got 2 P words for you. First P word is parochialism. Okay, that's bad. Stay away from it. The second P word is partnership. That is good. Embrace it. Always assume the best in your colleagues, even if they're not from your unit or your organization, and work together, be a team player, go out of your way to support your colleagues. That's all I have, Doug. And again, a pleasure to be with this team.
Okay, great. Let me just make a couple final comments. One, I think we all have had the privilege of serving with remarkable women and men doing remarkable things in remarkable places. And I think we all value that. We've had, the honor and the pleasure and the privilege of, working for those women and men, serving with them, and certainly leading them in every case here on the panel. I have a confidence, even though the challenges are existential, and I think they're significant and are plenty of obstacles in the path of our colleagues today, both the leadership and the followership of our respective agencies and departments. But, I have confidence that the resilience and the flexibility and agility of the current leadership and followership and the future leadership and followership within SOCOM as well as within the IC. I think they have the right stuff to be able to do this. It's not going to be easy. If you look at the alignment of any institution, which consists inherently of resources, workforce, its infrastructure, and culture, I think there's legion challenges in adapting all 4 of those elements to the new mission set of great powers competition. And while, we could admire all day long all of the obstacles, we could admire all day long, the positive aspects. I think, based on, the experience that our colleagues have had over the last couple of decades, a long period of time, and the history there, I think the lessons learned there, the talent that we have, I think, quite frankly, we're in as good a place as we can be to deal with this. And more importantly than that, as Ukraine has showed, we are in a way better shape than our adversaries are in dealing with us, I would expect. So anyway, I want to thank all of you for giving up your time, sharing your views, giving us an opportunity for the JSOU students and faculty to see this issue from your perspective. So the final word, as I would say, is want to thank JSOU for giving us this platform and forum. Thanks to Clarissa for doing all of the hard work to get us together. That was probably the most difficult aspect of this whole session today. And for Dave Oakley to have the vision to understand that, you know, a little humble Zoom session like this might, you know, help in some way to enlighten our SOF student colleagues. So anyway, gentlemen, ladies, thank you very much for being there. You guys be safe.